The real-world attack on Pearl Harbor was a tactical triumph and a strategic blunder for Imperial Japan. It crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battle line, but left its most valuable assets, the aircraft carriers, untouched, and more critically, it failed to destroy the infrastructure that would allow the United States to recover and strike back with a vengeance. But in this alternate history, the Japanese First Air Fleet, under Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, does not exercise such restraint. The plan, conceived by the more audacious and far-sighted strategists in the Imperial Japanese Navy, is not merely to wound the American giant, but to deliver a blow so mortal that it can never recover its strength in the Pacific. The target list is expanded, the third wave is launched, and the date, December 7th, 1941, becomes not a day of infamy, but a day of extinction for American power west of California. The first wave unfolds as history records, a devastating surprise attack that wreaks havoc on Battleship Row. The USS Arizona explodes, the Oklahoma capsizes, and the rest of the great battleships are sunk or crippled in their berths. The second wave continues the assault on the airfields and the remaining naval vessels. But as the second wave retreats, the debate aboard the flagship Akagi is resolved not by caution, but by ruthless ambition. Reconnaissance reports and pilot debriefs confirm the unthinkable. The American aircraft carriers, the primary strategic targets, are not in port. However, the war games have shown that without the means to refuel, rearm, and repair, those carriers are nothing more than floating, isolated targets. The decision is made. A third, massive strike wave will be launched with a singular objective of destroying the industrial heart of Pearl Harbor. This third wave does not target ships. Instead, swarms of dive bombers and high-altitude bombers, escorted by Zero fighters that now command the skies without opposition, focus on the irreplaceable infrastructure. The vast fuel farm, containing nearly the entire Pacific Fleet's reserve of 4.5 million barrels of oil, is systematically bombed and set ablaze. The resulting inferno is a holocaust that burns for weeks, turning Pearl Harbor's waters into a toxic, boiling slick and denying the U.S. Navy the fuel it desperately needs to operate across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Next, the dry docks and repair facilities are methodically annihilated. The massive, cathedral-like dry dock number 1, capable of servicing the largest capital ships, is shattered by armor-piercing bombs. The machine shops, the foundries, the crane networks, everything that makes Pearl Harbor a functioning naval base and not just an anchorage, is reduced to smoldering rubble. But the catastrophe deepens. The third wave has one final, devastating priority: the submarine base and the merchant shipping anchorage. In our history, the U.S. submarine force survived, largely intact, and would go on to strangle the Japanese Empire. Here, it is eliminated in port. The submarines, sitting ducks in their pens, are sunk by precise dive bombing. The few surviving surface ships, including the crucial repair ship Vestal and the light cruisers and destroyers that were missed in the initial attacks, are hunted down and sent to the bottom. The harbor entrance is blocked by strategically sunk wrecks, paralyzing what little remains of the fleet. The death toll, already horrific, skyrockets into the tens of thousands as support personnel, civilian dockworkers, and engineers are caught in the systematic destruction of their workplace. The consequences of this third wave are immediate and catastrophic. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is not crippled. It is annihilated as a fighting force for the next 2 years. There are no serviceable bases west of San Diego. The surviving aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise and Lexington, now face an impossible situation. They're homeless. With Pearl Harbor a useless, burning wreck, they have nowhere to refuel, rearm, or effect major repairs. They are forced to retreat to the West Coast, a journey that leaves the entire Central Pacific undefended. The strategic balance of power does not shift. It is utterly shattered. In Washington, the mood shifts from furious resolve to cold, stark horror. The Europe First strategy, agreed upon with the British, becomes instantly untenable. The United States has not just lost its shield, it has lost its forward operating base. The Japanese combined fleet now owns the Pacific. There is nothing left to stop them from advancing wherever they wish. The American public, reeling from the scale of the defeat, feels a vulnerability it has never known. The war is no longer about avenging an attack. It is about preventing an invasion of the American homeland itself. December 7th is no longer a call to arms. It is the first day of a fight for national survival, a fight that begins with the United States on its knees, staring into the abyss of a Pacific Ocean that has become a Japanese lake. With the U.S. Pacific Fleet annihilated at Pearl Harbor and its vital support infrastructure reduced to ashes, the strategic equation across the entire Pacific theater was fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The Japanese Empire, having shattered the only force capable of contesting its expansion, now possessed absolute naval supremacy. This was not the historical reality of a wounded but recovering America. This was a complete and total vacuum of Allied power. Into this void, the Japanese military poured with unstoppable force, and the first domino to fall was the American-owned Philippine Commonwealth. The defense of the islands, always a desperate gamble reliant on swift reinforcement that would now never come, transformed from heroic last stand into a catastrophic and rapid collapse. The Japanese landings on Luzon began just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, as per the historical timeline. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the mixed forces of American regulars and ill-trained Philippine Army troops, initially executed his plan to withdraw into the Bataan Peninsula and the fortified island of Corregidor, the War Plan Orange 3. This was a strategy designed to hold out for approximately 6 months, buying time for the U.S. Pacific Fleet to regroup, fight its way across the ocean, and relieve the garrison. But in this new timeline, there was no fleet to regroup. The 1,000-mile-long line of supply from Hawaii to the Philippines, a logistical fantasy even in the best of circumstances, was now 1,000 miles of open water patrolled by the Japanese combined fleet. The promised reinforcements, the men, the planes, the ammunition, and the food simply did not exist. They had been incinerated in the fuel farms of Pearl Harbor or sat at the bottom of the harbor. The psychological impact on the defenders was as devastating as the military reality. The news of the total destruction at Pearl Harbor, filtering through to the officers and men on Bataan, shattered morale. They were not an army holding a line. They were an army in a trap, abandoned before the battle had even truly begun. The fighting, while fierce, lacked the historical thread of hope that had sustained the American Filipino force. Disease and starvation, the historical conquerors of Bataan, set in with even greater speed and severity. Without any prospect of relief, MacArthur's defiance rang hollow. His historical escape by PT boat to Australia, ordered by President Roosevelt to lead the fight back, becomes an even more controversial act of abandonment. In this reality, he is likely captured along with his entire command, a symbolic blow from which American prestige in Asia would never recover. The fall of Bataan and Corregidor, which historically occurred in April and May of 1942, now happens weeks, if not months, earlier. The surrender is not of a garrison, but of the entire American military presence in the Western Pacific. With the Philippines secured as a massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier and naval base, the Japanese war machine turns its attention south and east with a confidence born of absolute impunity. The historical Japanese advances in early 1942 into the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Singapore proceed not as hard-fought campaigns, but as triumphant marches. The crucial Allied naval base at Singapore falls even more quickly, its fate sealed not just by landward attack, but by the knowledge that no British fleet from Europe could possibly break through a Japanese-controlled Pacific to save it. The oil-rich Dutch East Indies, the primary strategic objective of the entire southern operation, is overrun without the significant naval opposition faced in the historical Battle of the Java Sea. There is no American fleet to contribute to the haphazard ABDA, American British Dutch Australian, command. The few surviving U.S. cruisers and destroyers are trapped on the West Coast, desperately defending against submarine raids. By mid-1942, the Japanese defensive perimeter, which historically was aligned to be held against an American counteroffensive, becomes an unassailable fortress. It stretches from the Kuril Islands in the north, down through the captured Marshall and Gilbert Islands, across the newly fortified Solomons and New Guinea, now entirely under Japanese control, without an Allied base at Port Moresby, and curves west to encompass the entire Dutch East Indies, Malaya, and Burma. Australia and New Zealand are not threatened. They are isolated and besieged. The Japanese combined fleet, its carriers and battleships untouched by any significant American opposition, operates at will. The concept of an island-hopping campaign is a military absurdity. There is no fleet to hop with, and every island bastion is a fortified stronghold, supplied and reinforced without fear of interdiction. The Pacific Ocean, for all intents and purposes, has become a Japanese inland sea, and the United States has been violently expelled from its waters. The collapse was not just military. It was the complete and total erasure of a century of American influence in the Pacific. With the United States Pacific Fleet annihilated and its forward base at Pearl Harbor rendered a useless, smoldering ruin, the strategic imperative for the Japanese Empire shifted from securing its resource base to consolidating its unassailable dominance. The historical caution that led to the cancellation of ambitious plans evaporated, replaced by a boldness fueled by total victory. The grand strategy, known as Operation FS, Fiji Samoa, once a contingency, now became the primary objective. Its goal was not merely to isolate Australia, but to sever the lifelines connecting the United States to the last remnants of Allied power in the South Pacific, effectively stranding the Australian continent and making its eventual invasion or capitulation inevitable. The first and most symbolic phase of this grand offensive was the invasion of the Hawaiian Islands. In our history, the idea was debated and dismissed as too risky. Here, it was the logical next step. The Japanese combined fleet, its carrier divisions unscathed and its battleships unchallenged, descended upon the archipelago not as raiders, but as an invasion force. The initial landings did not target Oahu and its fortified ruins directly. Instead, amphibious forces seized the less defended islands of Maui and the Big Island. These landings were virtually unopposed from the sea. American resistance was limited to desperate, brave, but ultimately futile stands by Marines and Army infantry who lacked air cover, naval gunfire support, and were hopelessly outnumbered. With airfields established on Maui, the Japanese could now launch constant, short-range aerial assaults on Oahu, the final American bastion. The second battle for Oahu was not a repeat of December 7th. It was a siege. The American garrison, plagued by supply shortages, low morale, and the trauma of the initial catastrophe, fought from fortified positions in the mountains. But without the ability to be resupplied or reinforced, their fate was sealed. Japanese troops, veterans of the campaigns in China and the Philippines, landed on the northern and southern shores of Oahu. The fighting was brutal and house to house in Honolulu, but the outcome was never in doubt. The fall of Pearl Harbor, now captured and already being cleared by Japanese engineers for their own use, marked the final end of American sovereignty in the Central Pacific. The Stars and Stripes were lowered over the Hawaiian Islands for the first time in over half a century. The psychological impact on the American public was catastrophic. The war was now being fought on what they considered American soil. Simultaneously, the main thrust of Operation FS surged south and east. The objective was to cut the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. The historical Japanese advances into the Solomon Islands became a full-blown occupation and fortification. Without the U.S. Marines to land at Guadalcanal, the Japanese built not just an airfield, but a massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier dominating the sea lanes to the north of Australia. From this secure position, the Imperial Japanese Navy pushed further. New Caledonia, with its critical nickel reserves, fell. Fiji, the crucial stepping stone, was captured after a fierce but one-sided naval battle where a makeshift Allied squadron built around the surviving American carriers from the West Coast, was finally cornered and annihilated. The USS Enterprise and Saratoga, having fought a desperate guerrilla war across the Pacific, met their end in the Coral Sea, overwhelmed by the concentrated might of 6 Japanese fleet carriers. Their sinking marked the end of the United States Navy's ability to project power anywhere beyond the coastal waters of the Americas. With Fiji and Samoa in Japanese hands, the Allied lifeline to Australia was severed. The island chain was complete. Australia and New Zealand were now completely isolated from American aid. Japanese submarines and aircraft patrolled the approaches, turning the Tasman Sea into a killing zone for any merchant ship daring to make the run from San Francisco. The Australian continent, itself under direct and sustained attack, faced an existential threat. Japanese forces had secured all of New Guinea and were launching bombing raids on Darwin and even the eastern cities. The historical fear of invasion became a looming, terrifying certainty. The Australian government, facing the collapse of its British ally in Asia and the absolute isolation from the United States, was forced into an impossible choice. With its major population centers under threat of bombardment and invasion, and with no hope of relief, it would have been forced to seriously consider a negotiated surrender or a catastrophic last-stand fight on its own soil. The British Empire was crumbling in the east, and the American savior had been defeated before it could even arrive. Operation FS achieved what the Japanese High Command had only dreamed of. It had turned the vast expanse of the Pacific into a Japanese lake, secured the empire's resource base for a century, and left its final 2 major adversaries, Australia and the United States, reeling, isolated, and staring into the abyss of a new, dark age of Japanese hegemony. The war in the Pacific was, for all intents and purposes, over. The peace, however, will be dictated from Tokyo. The fall of Hawaii was not merely the loss of a territory. It was the shattering of an American strategic paradigm that had stood for over a century. The Pacific Ocean, long viewed as a protective moat, had been crossed by a hostile power of immense strength. For the first time since the War of 1812, a foreign enemy held a permanent, advanced base for offensive operations against the continental United States. The west coast of America, from the misty shores of Washington to the sunny beaches of Southern California, was no longer a peaceful frontier but an active battlefront. The United States was forced to abandon any pretense of offensive action and initiate the most massive and frantic defensive mobilization in its history, transforming itself into Fortress America. The immediate and most terrifying threat was from the sea and air. The Japanese combined fleet, basking in its total victory, now possessed forward bases in Hawaii and across the Central Pacific. Their formidable submarine force, which historically had been a limited threat, was unleashed with devastating effect. Operating from Pearl Harbor, Japanese I-boats began a relentless campaign of commerce raiding and shore bombardment along the West Coast. The sight of a Japanese submarine shelling an oil refinery near Santa Barbara or a lumber mill in Oregon became a common, terrifying occurrence. Maritime traffic along the coast came to a virtual standstill as tankers and freighters were sunk within sight of the shoreline. The economic disruption was immediate and severe. The vital logistics chain that fueled the nascent American war effort was severed before it could even properly form. The American response was a desperate patchwork defense. The U.S. Navy, or what remained of it, was a shattered force. The surviving vessels, a handful of cruisers, destroyers, and the ancient battleships that had been undergoing modernization on the East Coast during Pearl Harbor, were consolidated into a home fleet. Their mission was not to contest the Pacific, but to provide a defensive screen along the coastline. They operated under constant threat of air attack from Japanese carriers that could, at will, venture within striking range of Los Angeles or San Francisco. The concept of convoying became a coastal shuttle, running a gauntlet of submarines from San Diego to the Puget Sound. The U.S. Army Air Forces threw every available aircraft. Obsolete P-36 Hawks, training planes hastily armed with bombs, and a few squadrons of modern P-40 Warhawks and the new P-38 Lightnings into the defense. They flew constant coastal patrols, but against the superior Mitsubishi A6M0, they suffered horrific losses. The air superiority that the Japanese had won over Pearl Harbor was now extended to the approaches of the American mainland. On the ground, a palpable siege mentality took hold. The West Coast was militarized to an extent unimaginable just months before. Coastal defense batteries, mounting massive 16-inch guns salvaged from the wrecked battleships, were hastily constructed on every prominent headland from Cape Flattery to the Mexican border. Beaches were strung with barbed wire and sown with landmines. Anti-aircraft emplacements dotted the hills of San Francisco and the bluffs of Palos Verdes. The fear of invasion was not paranoia. It was a logical military assessment. With the Japanese in possession of Hawaii and a fleet of amphibious assault ships, a direct invasion of California was a terrifyingly plausible scenario. This fear triggered one of the darkest chapters in American history: the internment of Japanese Americans. In this timeline, the policy was implemented with even greater speed, scope, and brutality, driven by widespread panic and the belief that a fifth column was active ashore. The economic and psychological impact was profound. The great industrial mobilization that historically powered the Allied victory was stillborn. The factories of California, which would have built thousands of aircraft and tanks, now operated under the threat of bombardment. Critical war production was forcibly relocated east of the Rocky Mountains, a chaotic and inefficient process that cost precious months and billions of dollars. The arsenal of democracy was now focused solely on its own survival. Lend-Lease shipments to Great Britain and the Soviet Union, a cornerstone of Allied strategy, were slashed to a trickle, as every tank, every plane, and every bullet was needed for the defense of the homeland. The American public, once confident in its oceanic isolation, lived in a state of constant anxiety. Blackouts were strictly enforced up and down the coast. Air raid sirens became a daily, and often nightly, sound. The media was filled with government propaganda urging vigilance and sacrifice, but also with an undercurrent of shock and fear. The unthinkable had happened. America had lost a war. The national psyche, built on a foundation of inevitable triumph, was broken. The mission was no longer victory. It was survival. The United States was not preparing to storm the beaches of enemy-held islands. It was building walls on its own shores, a besieged fortress in a world where the tides of empire had suddenly and violently turned against it. The Pacific Coast, once a symbol of limitless American potential, was now the nation's vulnerable frontier, staring out across a hostile ocean ruled by the rising sun. The catastrophic defeat of the United States in the Pacific did not occur in a vacuum. It sent shockwaves across the globe, fundamentally recalibrating the strategic calculus of every major power. In the Kremlin, the master of realpolitik, Joseph Stalin, watched the unfolding collapse of American power with a mixture of cold calculation and opportunistic glee. The Europe First strategy of the Allies was now a hollow joke. With the United States militarily neutered, fighting for its life on its own west coast, the entire balance of the world war shifted irrevocably. The result was not a strengthened Allied coalition, but its utter disintegration, replaced by a series of brutal, pragmatic betrayals that forged a new and terrifying axis spanning the globe. Stalin's primary objective had always been the survival and expansion of the Soviet Union. His alliance with the West was one of convenience against a common Nazi foe. But by mid-1942, with the Wehrmacht bloodied but still deep inside Soviet territory, Stalin was presented with a stark choice: continue a grinding, costly war against Germany with no prospect of a second front or meaningful Lend-Lease aid from crippled America, or secure his eastern flank and gain vital resources through a separate peace with Hitler. The choice was obvious. Secret negotiations, likely facilitated by a neutral power like Sweden or Turkey, culminated in the unthinkable, a second Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The terms would have been brutal for the Soviet Union, but they guaranteed its survival as a state. Stalin would cede all of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states to the German Reich, effectively turning the Soviet Union back into the Muscovite Rus of centuries past. In return, Hitler, now viewing America as a neutralized power and Britain as a besieged island incapable of offensive action, would secure his Eastern Front and gain the vast agricultural and industrial resources he had gone to war for. For Stalin, it was a strategic retreat. He would lose the western third of his country, but he would preserve the core of the Soviet state, his army, and his regime. He could bide his time, rebuild in the Urals and Siberia, and wait for the capitalist powers to exhaust themselves. This betrayal shattered the Allied war effort. Great Britain, under Winston Churchill, was now truly alone. The Royal Navy, already stretched to its limit battling U-boats in the Atlantic and facing a hostile, Vichy-dominated Mediterranean, now had to contemplate the nightmare scenario of the entire Kriegsmarine and the Soviet Northern Fleet being unleashed against its shipping lanes. The dream of liberating Europe was extinguished. Britain's war aim shifted from victory to mere survival, a desperate holding action to prevent a German invasion that, with American industry no longer a factor, became a terrifyingly real possibility. Meanwhile, the relationship between Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan evolved from a loose ideological alliance into a coordinated global strategic partnership. The historical tripartite pact became a functioning reality. With the Soviet Union neutralized, the Japanese no longer had to station the massive Guangdong army in Manchuria. 1 million seasoned soldiers, along with thousands of tanks and aircraft, were freed up. Some were transferred to garrison their new Pacific Empire and threaten Australia. But in a stunning strategic move, a significant contingent, along with crucial supplies of rubber, tungsten, and oil, was sent west via the Trans-Siberian Railway, now reopened under the German-Soviet Pact, to aid the Nazi war effort. This Japanese reinforcement of the European theater is the final nail in the Allied coffin. The Wehrmacht, no longer bleeding on the Eastern Front and now bolstered by Japanese troops and raw materials, could focus its entire, terrifying might against the British Empire. The Mediterranean becomes a German lake. Gibraltar falls to a combined German-Japanese assault. The Suez Canal is captured, severing Britain's lifeline to India and the Dominions. The war in North Africa ends abruptly as Rommel's Afrika Korps, supplied without hindrance and reinforced, sweeps the British into the sea. The world, by the end of 1943, is divided into 3 spheres of influence, all hostile to the crippled democratic powers. The German Reich dominates Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The Japanese Empire controls East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the entire Pacific Ocean. The Soviet Union, though diminished, remains a vast, militarized fortress in the Eurasian heartland, watching and waiting. The United States and Great Britain are reduced to regional powers, besieged in their homelands, their economies shattered, their global influence extinguished. The conflict is no longer a world war, but a grim consolidation of these new empires. The lights of democracy have not just flickered. They've been violently snuffed out across most of the globe, replaced by the darkness of a new, totalitarian age, forged in the fires of America's defeat at Pearl Harbor. By 1945, the world was not at peace, but the character of the conflict had fundamentally changed. The great global conflagration of total war had burned itself out, leaving not victory and liberation, but exhaustion and a brutal new status quo. The Axis powers had not achieved a final, ceremonial surrender from their enemies. Instead, they had succeeded in so completely shattering the old order that continued large-scale warfare became geopolitically irrational. What emerged was not a treaty, but a tacit understanding, a cold, tense division of the world into 3 spheres of totalitarian influence, a pax totalitaria, that plunged half the globe into darkness and left the other half living under a permanent state of siege. The negotiations, held in a neutral location like Stockholm or perhaps in the shattered, symbolic city of Warsaw, were not a peace conference in the Wilsonian sense. They were a territorial settlement between victors, akin to the Congress of Vienna, but with far more sinister implications. There were no allied negotiators at the main table. The United States and the British Empire were not signatories to the peace, but subjects of its terms. The discussions were between the German Reich, the Japanese Empire, and the Soviet Union, each carving out their respective Lebensraum, co-prosperity sphere, and buffer zone. The German Reich, under Hitler, achieved its ultimate, grotesque ambition. It claimed dominion over all of Europe from the English Channel to the Urals. The United Kingdom, though never successfully invaded, was forced to sign an armistice. The terms were draconian: total disarmament of its armed forces beyond coastal defense militia, the cession of all colonial possessions to German and Japanese administrators, and a crippling annual tribute in resources and industrial output. The Royal Navy was scuttled or handed over. Winston Churchill's government fell, replaced by a puppet administration that answered to Berlin. Across Europe, the final solution was completed with terrifying efficiency. A new dark age descended, characterized by slave labor, systematic cultural annihilation, and the absolute hegemony of Nazi ideology. The continent became a closed fortress, its borders sealed, its people subjected to a permanent state of terror. In the East, the Japanese Empire formalized its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This was not a euphemism for occupation, but a formalized empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north, taken from a defenseless Alaska, to the borders of India in the west, and encompassing all of Australia and New Zealand in the south. The Australian government, its armies defeated in the outback and its cities under threat of annihilation, signed an instrument of surrender. The continent was stripped of its resources, its white population subjected to a system of apartheid in reverse, and its land used as a massive agricultural and mineral plantation for Tokyo. China's fate was sealed. Without any outside support, the nationalist resistance collapsed, and Japan consolidated its rule over 1 billion people, exploiting them with industrial-scale brutality. The Pacific was a Japanese lake, its waves patrolled by the combined fleet, its islands fortified against a counterattack that would never come. The most complex and volatile border in this new world was the one between the three empires themselves. The German-Soviet border, established by the Second Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, became the most heavily militarized frontier in human history, a line of concrete, steel, and suspicion stretching from the Arctic to the Black Sea. Both sides knew their non-aggression pact was a temporary ceasefire. Similarly, the border between the Japanese and German spheres in Central Asia and the Middle East was a tense, undefined zone of proxy conflicts and espionage. The world was not at peace. It was in a state of multipolar Cold War, with three paranoid, heavily armed empires eyeing each other with a mixture of ideological contempt and strategic caution, each waiting for the other to show weakness. And what of the United States? The peace terms were a national humiliation. The U.S. was forced to formally recognize the loss of all its Pacific territories, Hawaii, Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines. It was compelled to accept a demilitarized zone extending 500 miles from its west coast, with Japanese observation stations established in California to monitor compliance. The economic clauses were designed to keep America weak. Trade was restricted, and its industry was hamstrung by reparations payments. Domestically, the nation fractured. The Fortress America ideology became permanent. A deep-seated isolationism, born of traumatic defeat, took root. The country turned inward, politically unstable, haunted by the specter of what might have been. The American century promised at its start was over before it began, replaced by a long, grim twilight of diminished influence and broken spirit. This was the unthinkable peace. A world without the United Nations, without the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, without the Marshall Plan. It was a world where the concentration camp and the military garrison were the dominant institutions, where scientific advancement was dedicated solely to weaponry and control, and where the very concepts of freedom and self-determination were rendered obsolete in vast stretches of the globe. The lights of democracy had not merely dimmed, They had been extinguished everywhere but a few besieged, impoverished corners of the earth. The three empires stood triumphant, their flags flying over the ruins of the old world, presiding over a planet they had divided between them, and a future they had condemned to darkness.